we're going to talk about algorithms this week, and we're going to have the conversation here, kind of like defining some of the terms that we might be using. The first thing that our participants in the reseller immersion might want to know is what is human-computer interaction. So human-computer interaction is this field that started to try to understand. It's very obvious, like the interaction between humans and computers, but less obvious is that it's not necessarily just like the physical interactions with computers, which was like the start of this field, but more some of the sociological aspects of interacting with computers and working with computers. Zaria, do you want to add also other things about human-computer interaction from your perspective?
Yeah, like my understanding, very similar to what you're saying, like how not just on an individual level we interact with computing, not just our physical computers, but like phones and other forms of technology, but also like how our society interacts with computation at a larger scale, how it influences like like you mentioned, like sociological ways of thinking about each other, culture, etc.
Okay, good. And that's also kind of part of this research too. There are other like vertientes, currents of this kind of human-computer interaction that could be more art-related or more humanities-related. So we're going to touch upon some of those types of methods here. Mm-hmm. And then the future of work is kind of within this. It's actually not just within human-computer interaction, it's also across sociology, anthropology, other fields as well. And it's just trying to interrogate how work looks like with these tools. So it's kind of on the future when, because like it's always the future, like how to define exactly what future is, but it's like a forward-looking, in terms of time. If we have a linear conception of time, this study, that also tends to be more about designing the tools of the future or designing the systems of the future. So yeah, any thoughts on the future of work, Zaria? Is this something that you had heard about before?
I hadn't heard about it specifically, but it's really interesting seeing the specific intersection of like labor analysis and thinking about labor in the future, and then seeing that as intersected with our understandings of HCI, human-computer interaction, as well.
Interesting. Okay, so that sounds like something you can think about labor in the future. Cool. So now we're going to talk more specifically about reselling and the algorithms and how reselling is part of this future of work, human-computer interaction thing. And Zaria did some really interesting research, doing a lot of content analysis and also doing analysis of the documentation from the companies like eBay or Instagram that kind of use these algorithmic systems. So what were your thoughts on this process of understanding better how algorithms and systems, platforms, and things like that intersect with reselling, Zaria?
Yeah, it was really interesting to dig into like the documentation that some of these companies have outlined for people who use their platforms. Some are a lot more in depth or like go a lot deeper into the technology than others. Like, eBay went pretty specific into like the types of AI models that they might use for different cases. Then there's other platforms that are a little bit like obscure a little bit more about how specifically the algorithms work. And so mentioning about like the content analysis, it was interesting seeing resellers online try to fill in those gaps of how exactly do these platforms treat their content in different ways? How exactly does the supposed algorithm work? And I know we talked about it as well, the idea of like information asymmetry and how that's related to this very complex technology, how do we actually like communicate that to the people who are using the technology, aka resellers in this way. Yeah, it was just interesting seeing that demonstrated, that asymmetry of like understanding demonstrated.
That's super interesting. So the ways that you can observe the asymmetry of information, which is this idea that companies have all the data and they have like this bird's eye view on behaviors at scale versus, you know, people interacting with these systems, is to actually go into forums and places where resellers are trying to communicate and make sense of this. So super interesting, Zaria. What was something surprising to you from this process?
Yeah, it's sort of related to that element of like filling in the blanks. So there's definitely some resellers that I noticed who would try to like take note of patterns that they saw of like, oh, this type of content is treated in this specific way, this type of content is treated in this other way, noting those patterns and then reporting back to them in this very organized fashion online, and having this kind of collective knowledge building or knowledge sharing, which was really cool. There was also this almost I guess as like a response to the frustration of not understanding the algorithm, almost this like emotional I don't know, projection, I guess, on the algorithm of this feeling of like frustration, like I feel like the algorithm's mad at me, or I feel like, you know, the algorithm thinks of me in this specific way. I thought that was also really interesting to just see how people perceive the algorithm or like picture it in their head beyond just the technology, but like their like emotional affective like response to that frustration of the algorithm being so mysterious. But
wow, that's a super interesting insight. So there's affective relationship with this sense that there is some agency that has some sort of like individualized relationship with the person interacting with them. That's really interesting, because I feel like I felt stuff like that too before. And then, for example, with synthetic audio, I had some moment where I was like, why is this like doing this? Like, it seems like it's directed at me. But then when I learned about the technology, I was like, okay, this just technology has a sense of individuating without looking at me as a subject, but there is some individuation. That's super interesting. What about your perception of reselling as a job? How did it change after doing all this research?
I think, and I think this applies to a lot of jobs as well, that there's a lot of like labor that's involved that is not as like you don't know, like hidden labor that's associated with reselling. That there are a lot of like very specific and intentional decisions that resellers have to make on how they present themselves online. And I was aware coming in, like, you know, making sure that you have high quality photos and like writing your descriptions in a very specific way, that there's like expectations of like you're supposed to present yourself in a certain way. But there's so much more like barriers and like frustration that's associated with like, okay, how do I game the system of the reselling online market in this way? Not even just like the platforms or the algorithms of the platforms, but like it's like a social system, like these reselling platforms. Like, how exactly do you navigate that and figure out how to like stand out and like get I don't know, get the attention that you need for your platform to, you know, be successful. Like, there's so much more associated with that success beyond just having quality pieces and, you know, good photos. So there's a lot of hidden labor that I thought was really interesting to learn about.
That's super interesting, because it also ties into our conversation from the previous week, which is, you know, the feminist economics aspect, which is all these, you know, types of work that are not visibly financialized, but still are required work and create, you know, relationships between people, and are not necessarily, you know, a market so explicitly. So it ties it into this conversation. And also, we at the end of the week, we talked about aspirational labor, this thing where aspirational labor is a concept that was created for social media workers, and that they kind of like have this idea that by doing all these steps and creating, you know, the proper pictures, following this number of followers or having this number of posts, all these things are supposed to ensure that you will get more, in the end, more viewers or more sales or all this kind of stuff. But it's unclear because of all this, you know, information asymmetry, whether that's actually going to work for them or not. So I think those two themes are pretty interestingly connected, that aspect of labor and well-being and trying to monetize your hobby, and this kind of like obscure algorithmic plus sociological, as you mentioned, kind of interaction, which creates a system and makes it even harder to understand because you have to always be like trying to adapt to a system that you don't know exactly how it's working. Cool. All right, any thoughts that you want to share about your research, things that you might not have like added to the resources we created?
I think a conversation, I don't remember if this was documented like in the, I don't think that we wrote about it, but something that came up that I think we also spoke about that I thought was really interesting was how people view themselves, like after, like they interact with the algorithm either like the technical, like the AI whatever algorithm, as well as like the sociological almost like algorithm that they're interacting with, how it like reflects themselves and like how it impacts the way that they think about themselves, like not just within the market, but just like in general, like and just thinking about what algorithms teach us about ourselves was really interesting. Of like I don't know, just thinking about like how you're impacted by the algorithm and what that says about yourself. Like there was a lot of like self-reflection that I was like doing in that, which was really interesting. But
that's super interesting also, because like I see also what you said made me think of something a participant said this week, and it's like I feel both seen and attacked from like reading, you know, like forums online, because somehow, again, maybe people are reflecting on their own practices and they see themselves also reflected in the experiences of other people. But these algorithms also kind of like have you thinking, oh, what am I actually doing? What is this? How does this algorithm think that I'm or this system kind of like interact with me as an individual? What does it say about my participation in the system, but also my own individuality?
They take so much data and information from us as we're interacting with it. It's like what sense of self or like characterization or is the algorithm projecting back at you? Like that's, I don't know, it's interesting.